is visible, you're good to go.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Sakshi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And what I'm presenting today is an early stages project which looks at how news behaviors of audiences manifest online. And I do this by examining followers of traditional and digital journalists on Twitter, or now as it's called X. The goal in general is to come at whether news audiences online, especially on platforms, are polarized. And if so, what is the extent of that? So this is important to study because, as we all know and have experienced, how information flows to us is increasingly curated by platforms. At the same time, there's more choice available to us than ever before. So choice making is fundamental to the equation. But what is the basis of that choice? A lot of work looks at how these choices are made through the lens of selective exposure, where individuals tend to opt into ideologically aligned news media. A consequence of a high amount of selectivity in a news context is what results in a phenomena that we all now know as echo chambers or filter bubbles, which implies a limited cross-exposure between different sides of the political aisle. But evidence is varied on the issue, where some people have found a very high degree of selectivity on social and traditional media especially. Others have found that that is not the case, that is less so, where a frequent argument is that popularity persists and popular media or platforms invite or gain audiences from all sides of the political aisle. So this is what I'm trying to get at through an examination of journalists and their followers on Twitter. But why am I doing that? This is because examining followership allows me to unpack the most fundamental structure of the platform, which is following people. And not a lot of work has looked at that. I'm also looking at journalists because that may suggest that relatively greater or relatively more deliberate self-selection has taken place on part of the user. So if you think about it, there's a difference between following a reporter from Times of India, whereas following Times of India itself. And there's a reason for that. News media, there's another reason for that, right? News media in India offer an interesting gateway into examining how audience flows channel ideological positions. That's because, as we all know, traditional media in India have pivoted to pro-government or rather pro-BJP stances, whereas digital media offer greater variety as well as alternative voices. And there's a more interesting caveat to this. Several journalists who were formerly with traditional media now have YouTube careers. So the approach of capturing journalists rather than outlets allows me to include them as well in this complex. So how did I go about it? I used a dismissed data set published by the organizers of this conference. Thank you so much for the resource. And I drew out a list of Indian journalists. I culled the followers of these individuals using the academic API of Twitter till it gave way. What I got was a rather comprehensive network structure involving 1,508 journalists and their more than 44 million followers. So as a next step, I hand-coded each individual journalist organizational affiliation and the legacy status of that organization, whether it was digital or traditional. So how do we get at selectivity, which is where I've started, right? I create a fairly intuitive measure of audiences' media preference, which is simply the proportion of how many traditional journalists they follow out of all the journalists they follow. So if you fall on the right of the scale, you prefer traditional journalists more. And if you're to the left of the scale, then digital. Using this measure, I calculate the overlap coefficient as the area shared between the distributions of those who prefer digital or those who prefer traditional. In English, it tells you, in English, it means that it tells you the proportion of individuals who prefer both. And since we don't know how much selectivity is too much, how much is too little, I create a somewhat arbitrary threshold of 0.5, which is to say that about half of these distributions will overlap, just to create a measure to compare against. Yeah. So at the level of raw preferences, simply raw preferences untreated of users, you see that we find an overlap of 44%, which means that 44% of the distributions of those who follow traditional journalists or digital journalists overlap, which is not very far away from the arbitrary threshold I started with. But if you were to see each journalist as an average of everyone who follows them, you see that the overlap is much lower, which means that journalists cater to distinct audience tastes, and those tastes don't overlap very much. And this also creates an interesting scale on which to observe your favorite journalist. If you were to lay them out on this axis, you'll find that it somewhat approximates their ideological positions as well. But this is, of course, really speculative and at early stages at this time and needs a little more validation. But it still gives you a more intuitive look at where each individual lies based on their popularity. And finally, if you consider not raw preferences of users, but the average of slants of all journalists and individual follows, just to approximate a semblance of a social graph, which would mean that if I as an individual follow 5 journalists, my preference would be the average of what those journalists slant is. Because in a network, you're not isolated, you're not atomistic, you're a sum of different parts. Then in that case, you see slightly more overlap between different users and their preferences. And this time it's slightly above our arbitrary threshold of 0.5, which means that about half of these distributions overlap, about half of the individuals here may share preferences with another one. But in any case, I'm almost at time, I believe. So here are the takeaways so far. It seems that there's limited overlap between individuals and their preferences. I also find that people have distinct tastes. At the individual level, the distribution we see is extremely bimodal. So people either gravitate to traditional media or gravitate completely to digital media. There's very little cross-pollination in between of people who prefer both, which means that in some sense, if you have felt that you're in an echo chamber online, that you don't get to hear the other side, you probably are. The other interesting part that I got to was that even on Twitter, organizations which are not natively digital, they predominate. And that could well be attributed to the social and economic capital that these organizations have accumulated over time. And digital media are still at nascent stages. They're still very young and growing, as a result of which we kind of see that this space is kind of captured by traditional media, which have been popular since time immemorial. These findings, these early findings, are also critical to think about when we discuss things like the Broadcasting Services Regulation Bill, which is looming on the horizon, because it kind of tells you that should a regulation like this be implemented, where news, even online, will be controlled based on certain seemingly arbitrary regulations by the government, there might be a significant proportion of people who feel the shock. They may choose to opt out of the news ecosystem altogether, but they will feel the shock nevertheless.
Sakshi, you're at time. Would you
Yep, I'm done. Yeah, that's all. Thank you. Looking forward to your questions.